Today, my guest is author Margaret George, and we're going to be talking to her about her new novel, Elizabeth I from Viking, a division of Penguin Group. Now, Margaret is an acclaimed historical novelist whose best-selling works includes, among others, the autobiography of Henry VIII, Mary, Queen of Scotland and the Isles, and the memoirs of Cleopatra. There's many others, of course. And she lives with her husband in Wisconsin, and that's where she is as we speak. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is quite an interesting book. I just cannot imagine doing a book of this magnitude, and we are going to discuss that and how you did it and everything. But let's begin by giving an overview of what the book is about, and that's, I'm sure, going to be tough to do, but try your best.
Well, not that difficult. Actually, Elizabeth lived for quite a long time, and she reigned for quite a long time. And I decided to concentrate on the last 15 years of her life for several reasons. First of all, because most people don't do that because they like to do the early part and then they kind of run out of steam before they get to the end.
Right.
And so they cover the end, very quickly. But it was a really important period in her life because it starts with the Armada and it goes through the Earl of Essex and the whole business about the succession and a lot of very interesting characters. Like Shakespeare didn't even come to London at all until the Armada. So it's a time that is often neglected, but I found interesting, and I wanted to study, her aging. And it turned out to be, of course, longer than I thought.
Well,
I can't
that's
imagine
okay.
It was supposed to be shorter, because I was not doing her whole life, but it turned out, I'm glad I didn't tackle her whole life. So there are some, flashbacks, and you get a background, but that's really what it's all about.
Good. Well, and we're going to get into a few of the specifics about that, and certainly we want people to read this book, and I want to emphasize again that it is a novel, and so we're going to discuss how you write a novel about such an amazing character. But let's start, first of all. You travel to the locations to do your research. Now, how long did it take you from start to finish for this book?
Well, technically, it'd say 6 or so years, but that's really kind of misleading because I had done 2 earlier books near that period. I had done the autobiography of Henry VIII, which, of course, he's Elizabeth's father, and I had done Mary, Queen of Scots. And she and Elizabeth were enemies in her middle years. So I had a lot of the background already, so I was not starting from scratch by any means. Even so, though, it took about 6 years. I divided into half, like 3 years for research and another 3 for writing it and revising it.
Well, that 6 years maybe seems like a long time, but that seems amazing to me that you could complete such a book in that period of times. Talk a little bit about how you researched when you were on location and what locations you went to.
Well, I have to clarify that I don't do primary research, which is where you go to libraries and you read old documents. I get my material from historians that have already done that homework for me. Mm-hmm. So when I go to the places, it's more for the atmosphere of what it looked like and felt like, and that I can retrace, say how long would it take to get from one side of London to the other if you were walking. How fast does the Thames flow? Did it flow that fast when she was queen? Because they've embanked it and it's deeper and narrower than it was in her time. So, and it's not tidal past a certain point. So, all those kind of things. You go to see the environment, I think, and just get a feeling for it. And those kind of questions that you can't answer unless you actually go there.
Well, that's terrific because I wonder how many authors do that. Certainly, if you're doing nonfiction, that makes sense. But and it would seem to be important in this situation. But there are writers that do just rely on the secondary material and don't do it. Did you do most of it in London, or I imagine you had to go out into the countryside as well? Did you not?
Yes, I did. Although Elizabeth didn't travel that much. Henry VIII at least got over to France, but Elizabeth really never left England, and she didn't travel very widely over England. So I didn't have to go that far afield. Just in the London area, the southern part of England, Cambridge, the Fen country. In the book, I have her going to Wales or trying to go to Wales. And in the book, she doesn't get there, and in real life, she never got there either.
Well, did she go to the country house? Was there a country house?
Yeah. Well, Hatfield House is where she was brought up as when she was a princess. She spent a lot of time there. It's a beautiful old house, and thank goodness part of it was saved. You know how they want to, in the 1600s, they wanted to knock it down and build a modern house,
right?
Which, of course, would be old to us now. They did knock down a lot of it and build a new part, but the Great Hall and some of the other buildings were spared. And that's wonderful because that's where she had her first council meeting, was in that Great Hall, and the grounds are still there. And so I'm so glad those people ran out of money.
Yes,
they
right.
couldn't do it.
Where is Hatfield House located? What part of England?
Well, it's about 14 miles north of London, actually. It was once out in the country, but of course London has spread out so that it's in the London environs. You can't take the tube out there, but you can take a train.
Well, in her time, though, I suppose 14 miles wasn't like just next door. I mean...
No.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be healthy, and, she was out there in the country, and it was wholesome, and of course the park is still there, and you really get the feeling. It feels country-like when you're out there.
Now, we know that Henry VIII was her father, and for the listeners, who was her mother?
Her mother was the famous Anne Boleyn, the one that Henry VIII fell in love with, and they broke from the Catholic Church so that he could marry her. And then, of course, there's all the scandal about her being executed. And so Elizabeth was only 2.5 when her mother was executed. So she probably did not have any concrete memories of her, but she must have had some kind of maybe subconscious memories of her.
Can you talk a little bit? I know that most of the book takes place in the later years, but what can you tell us about her early childhood? And at what age did she become queen? Let's start with that. How old was she when she became queen?
Well, she was 25, and the thing is that her father died when she was 13, and then she really started her political education because first her brother became king, and then her sister became queen. And there were people who wanted to use her politically, that didn't like the king or the queen. And she had to learn very quickly how to keep out of trouble, how to keep suspicion away from herself, even though she didn't end up in the Tower one time. But she learned how to keep her own counsel. She learned to not let people pin her down to anything.
Well, now you're talking about, pardon me, Margaret, you're talking about when she was queen, but what was her...
No, I'm talking about before she was queen.
Before she was queen.
I'm saying, when she was
I misunderstood you. Okay.
That's why she came to the throne so well prepared to be queen.
I see.
Because she had this kind of baptism of fire political education in the 11 years between when her father died and he was king, and then she had to negotiate and navigate those years in between when she was just a successor, but she had to keep out of trouble and not get executed like Lady Jane Grey, because people always wanted to use her for their schemes. So by the time she became queen, she was 25. She was a very savvy character.
Uh-huh. Now it's hard to keep track of all of the characters because of all of Henry
No.
VIII's wives and what have you. Who then succeeded him after his death?
Okay. Well, Henry had just wanted a son so badly. I mean, and he was very disappointed when Elizabeth turned out to be a girl instead of a son. And he had an older girl, Mary, and so finally his little son Edward was born. And the child that Henry wanted so badly was only 9 when Henry died. So you had all the problems of a child king, and of course he was ruled by a protector who wanted to basically run the country, and he died when he was 16.
Oh.
So, and some people think he was poisoned, actually.
Wouldn't be surprised, would
you? Wouldn't be surprising. And then his sister, Mary, his half-sister Mary, known to history as Bloody Mary, became queen because she executed all those Protestants.
And so who was her mother?
Her mother was Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And so Mary was already grown up when she became queen.
I see.
She was very bitter about her mother having been divorced by Henry. She was fanatically Catholic and was determined to bring England back to the Catholic fold, no matter what it took. And so she was kind of a disastrous queen. So I think Elizabeth learned all the things you shouldn't do, watching her brother and sister with their really unsuccessful reigns. And then when she inherited the crown, there were no more after her. There were no more half-brothers or cousins or anything.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit about your approach to the story. I think is very interesting because you use 2 narrators, Elizabeth, of course, and then how do you pronounce the second character's name?
I think you pronounce her name, well, her real name was Letitia, but her family name, she was always called Lettuce, and I think you pronounce it almost like the thing that you eat. Lettuce.
Really? Lettuce.
Yes.
And her last name?
Her Knowles.
Knowles. Letitia Knowles. Talk a little bit about her. Lettice.
You could call her Lettice, or actually sounds better than lettuce, doesn't it?
Well, it does.
Let's call her Lettice.
Let's call her Lettice.
She was a descendant of Mary Boleyn. And, everybody that's read The Other Boleyn Girl knows about Mary Boleyn. And so she was the granddaughter of Mary Boleyn. So she was a cousin of Elizabeth. And she was the person who married Robert Dudley, who was Elizabeth's kind of quasi-consort, boyfriend, long-suffering suitor. And they were really, and for that she really got in Elizabeth's bad books because Elizabeth thought she was a, man-hungry, social-climbing tramp. She wasn't really, but she's had a terrible reputation, among novelists and since then because Elizabeth called her the she-wolf, and she didn't have much use for her. But I wanted there to be another character that would give you a different viewpoint of Elizabeth, so that Elizabeth is telling her story, but there's somebody else who knows her very well, is involved with her, and can give you a different perspective, so that you can see how Elizabeth might have appeared to other people. Plus, Lettice had a much more risque and more scandalous and operatic life than Elizabeth, because she was married 3 times.
Oh my!
And she had a reputation as being kind of promiscuous. Her first husband, they're suspected of being poisoned. Her second one, she took up with his horse groom while he was still alive, and then married him. He was about 20 years younger than she was, and she was the mother of the notorious Earl of Essex.
Wow.
Who is so famous for being the guy who was 30 years younger than Elizabeth, and he was kind of some think her boy toy. That is the one episode most people know about the last years of her life, is the dashing, unstable, charismatic Earl of Essex who ends up getting executed. And he was played by Errol Flynn in a movie once. And he's sort of that sort of person. Actually, I wanted to explore that a little bit more and get to know him a little bit better. I think that there's some surprises in the book about him that he really wasn't quite like Errol Flynn. But anyway, I think that people will find it interesting. He was 33 years younger than she was, so there, right there, you have an interesting drama.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then that leads me to let's get the big question over with. She was called the Virgin Queen, but so many things you read do say she had lovers and so forth. What proof did you find that she actually was the Virgin Queen?
Well, I'm one of the few that thinks, and the few novelists, that is. I mean, historians don't think that she had lovers as much as novelists do. For one thing, she had the example of her mother, and she herself had been called by her Catholic enemies the incestuous bastard born of a notorious courtesan.
Oh, my.
And, yes, and so she was considered to be, unchaste anyway by the people that said, well, like mother, like daughter. And she didn't want to give people any proof of that, I don't think. But also, she went to great lengths to advertise herself as a virgin. She was always being painted holding sort of symbols of virginity and giving speeches about being a virgin. But more than that, it was just impossible to have any privacy in that court and in those times. And so, since you had a lot of spies around, and Anne Boleyn, the love letters that Henry VIII wrote to Anne Boleyn were stolen by a Vatican spy, and they're still in the Vatican archives. That was the kind of juicy proof they would have loved to have gotten hold of. So I just think that since power was her main desire, I don't think she would have risked it. It's more a character study of her than actual proof one way or the other.
Well, the other thing that I found interesting too in some of the material that was sent to me was the fact that she seemed to want to keep her reputation really clean and not have a lot of things come out in history after she died. And you talk about it's almost like she cleansed letters and papers and that kind of thing. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. She was probably the first modern person in the sense of manipulating her image. Mm-hmm. She was very conscious of her image. She had portraits that were unflattering, rounded up, and it was illegal to have them, and you had to have a special kind of approved image. And so I think that was her foremost concern, was to keep her image pure and just what she wanted it to be. And I mean, I think that the love letters and the love poems and all the flirtations were kind of enough for her. She didn't need the whole thing.
Right. What's important, too, I think, to talk about is the fact that whenever you read about court life, no matter where it is, there's always the intrigue. And, of course, Henry's a good example of that. They're all killing each other, sending each other to the dungeon. Talk about her strengths to rule and not be overthrown as others were. How did that happen, that she could rule for so long? And I'm sure there were some that would have liked to have gotten her out of there.
Yeah, well, she had that early political education of what not to do. But then also she was blessed with apparently a supreme desire, ability to read character. She seldom made a mistake about what someone's character was like, and she chose very wise and very loyal advisors and counselors. So she didn't have that political thing where you have your own people plotting against you. She basically kept people with her till they died, and she had a protective sort of cadre around her. And she was very good at putting off decisions that would make her unpopular. People didn't like it that she took so long to make a decision.
Right.
But she weighed things very carefully. They say that tragedy is the result of haste and waste, and that her traits were thrift and delay.
Yeah.
And that's true, thrift and delay. And so she kept control of things around her quite well.
Well, what was her greatest weakness? Did she have a weakness?
I think she had a weakness in that she did, well, they say that when you're a divine right monarch, especially in England at that time, you supposedly can't make a mistake. So Henry VIII solved the problem of once he made up his mind to something, he never, ever, ever changed his mind, because by definition, he couldn't, his decision was always right. And Elizabeth solved the problem by trying not to ever make an irrevocable decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that has a really bad effect when you need to make a decision and when things are kind of drifting. So I think that was her greatest weakness, was her not wanting to say. She never actually tried to make any kind of commitment that was steadfast, and she preferred halfways of dealing, and it's called answerless.
Right.
That's her own word.
Who was her closest advisor?
Well, William Cecil was the person who had been her surveyor when she was still a princess, and as soon as she became queen in that great hall that was her first council meeting, she appointed him to be her, what we call prime minister, principal secretary. And she said, I want you to always tell me the truth, not what I want to hear, but what I need to hear. Mm-hmm. And he always did. They were a great working partnership. And he stayed her prime minister till he died in his late 70s. Hmm. And then his son took over, who had been trained too. So she had that whole family that served her through her whole reign.
Why did she never marry?
Well, she couldn't marry. She was in a dilemma because if there was no such thing as a king consort then, there was no like Prince Albert who's married to Queen Victoria. Whoever she married, if she married a foreign prince, he would become King of England. And I mean really, really King of England. And if she married a subject, then they would divide her other subjects, because what happens is that then all the relatives of the queen's husband all swarm to court and take all the positions.
Right.
And so she, in a way, couldn't marry because there was no one for her to marry that would not cause more political problems than just not being able to provide an heir. And then also her psychology was she didn't want anybody to be her master in this. She said, we will have but one mistress here and no master. And I think she didn't want to be dominated.
Well, good for her. I want to quickly say also that you have been on tour, and I want to mention that you are going to be in La Jolla, California on June 16th at 7:30.
That's right.
June 16th. At 7:30 at Warwick's in La Jolla. So for those of you that are listening online from La Jolla, you can go see and meet Margaret at that event. So,
thanks for mentioning that. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people that would love to come and hear you and meet you and talk more about Elizabeth. Let's give me and again, I'm so sorry we have to be brief, but give me some brief ideas as to what were the difficulties in writing about a woman like Elizabeth in a fictional manner.
Well, I think the thing is you always infuse some of yourself into the person. Mm-hmm. I tried to learn everything about her that I could, about her personality, her preferences. Like she didn't like perfumed leather, all these little things and then big things. But in the end, you have to give the dummy life. I mean, it's like a wax thing otherwise. And so how do you make them live? How do you make them seem like real people? I think it's a kind of magic that you kind of pray you're going to be able to do it. And you don't always know. I didn't know whether I'd done it or not till I was finished. That's the weird thing, is you're writing it, you're feeling it, you're with the character, you feel like the character, but will anybody else agree? And when you're all finished and you put it aside and you let it cool, when you look at it again, is it real or is it just like,
Sure.
Did the wax thing come to life or not.
The mystery of writing and a writer.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I think one of the things is if you write every day, it takes on a life of its own much more than if you kind of stop and start, because then you're sort of in it and it begins to grow.
I think every writer that I have interviewed has said that. I think that's very
Really?
true. Taking a life on its own and writing every day and staying inside the character. I was curious in any other material that you read and so forth. Did you ever find anything that showed she was not as cold and calculating as she's often portrayed, especially in the movie versions?
Yeah, that's true. Usually played by Betty Davis or Linda Jackson.
Yeah, right.
And they, again, see, they're infusing their personality into it. I think that she showed great tenderness toward her female attendants. I mean, you always see the thing about her being angry at Bess Throckmorton for making off with Raleigh and stuff, but she had some very close attendants who are in the book, Marjorie and Catherine Carey, and she was very tender with them, and you see some letters that she wrote to them, especially Marjorie Norris, who lost several sons in wars that were being fought for Elizabeth, and you really see the care. She would sign things to her counselor, to your loving sovereign. And then she'd sign her name. Can you imagine the president saying, "Your loving president"? But she had
I don't know. That sounds kind of nice. Maybe. Yeah. Maybe that would.
I think it's nice.
Yeah.
But I just mean, she was a very personable to those that she cared about, and of course the common people. She seemed to have a real touch with them. She seemed to always know what to say to them, and I think she genuinely liked going out and meeting them, and I have a scene where someone says, "How can you stand those boring plays and the awful off-tune music and the bad poems?" And she said, "Well, because it pleases them to give them to me, and I like hearing them."
Yeah,
and I think that she showed a joy of being with people.
Well, and before we run out of time, I'd like to ask you, what do you want the readers to come away with after reading about her?
I guess I would like them to come away, like you said, knowing some of the burdens that she carried, and understanding what her life was like and why she did the things that she did. But I hope they like her, too.